All right, so you want to know more about Richard Rorty, huh? Well, you've come to the right place because today we're doing a deep dive into Rorty. And to guide us, we've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Rorty. Now, I know philosophy can get a little dense sometimes, but trust me, we're going to keep things clear and engaging.
Oh, absolutely. Rorty's ideas are way too interesting to get lost in the jargon.
Exactly. And just glancing at the material, I was struck by Rorty's unique blend of influences. Like he called himself a postmodernist bourgeois liberal, drew from Darwin, and had some pretty strong opinions about where philosophy should be going.
You hit the nail on the head there. I think that really gets to the heart of Rorty's work. He wasn't afraid to shake things up and challenge the status quo.
Yeah, he definitely wasn't. So before we get into all that, let's start with the basics. Who was Richard Rorty and what shaped his thinking?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia tells us he was born in 1931, grew up in a politically active left-leaning family in New York City, and went on to study at the University of Chicago and then Yale.
Wow, talk about a pedigree for a philosopher.
Yeah.
Hers are some serious academic institutions.
Oh, absolutely. And it's important to remember his upbringing in what he called the anti-communist reformist left really had a profound impact on his worldview. This is a time of intense intellectual and political debate, so those early influences really stuck with him.
Makes sense. Those formative experiences can really set the stage for a thinker's trajectory.
Okay.
So what happened after those big-name universities? How did Rorty's career unfold?
Well, he went on to hold positions at Wellesley Princeton, the University of Virginia and Stanford, engaging with and often challenging the major philosophical trends of his time.
Clearly not one to shy away from a good intellectual sparring match. So one of Rorty's most central and, let's be honest, controversial ideas is his critique of traditional epistemology. In his book, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, he really goes after this idea that knowledge is like a mirror reflecting reality. Can you break that down for us? What exactly did Rorty mean by that mirror metaphor, and why did he have such a problem with it?
Well, for centuries, Western philosophy has operated under this assumption that our minds are like mirrors that passively reflect the world outside us. So the goal of knowledge becomes to create an accurate representation of reality in our minds.
Okay, so far so good. So it's like we're trying to create a mental photograph of the world as it truly is. But where does Rorty's critique come in?
Well, Rorty argued that this whole mirror idea was a misleading way to think about knowledge. It leads to a bunch of philosophical problems, especially the problem of skepticism. Like, if knowledge is all about accurately mirroring reality, how can we ever be certain that our mental representations are actually true? How do we know our senses aren't deceiving us or our minds aren't distorting things?
That's a really interesting point. It seems like we get trapped in this endless pursuit of certainty, always chasing this elusive guarantee that we've got it right.
Precisely. And Rorty argued that this pursuit of certainty was basically a dead end. It keeps us stuck in this cycle of trying to prove that our knowledge perfectly matches some mind-independent reality.
Okay, so if knowledge isn't about mirroring reality, then what is it, according to Rorty? Are we just making things up?
He wouldn't say we're just making things up, but rather that knowledge is a lot more grounded in language and social practices than traditional philosophy gave it credit for. Instead of looking for this perfect match between our thoughts and the world, he thought we should focus on how our language, how our vocabularies evolved to help us cope with the world.
So it's more about how we talk about things and make sense of the world within our communities, rather than finding some objective truth out there.
You're getting warmer. He was really influenced by thinkers like Wittgenstein and Davidson, who emphasized the role of language and social stuff in shaping how we understand things. Rorty argued that knowledge isn't about finding some foundation outside of ourselves. It's about justifying our beliefs within our communities through dialogue and conversation.
That's a pretty big shift from the traditional view. It sounds like he's saying knowledge is less about solitary contemplation and more about a shared process of inquiry and understanding.
You got it. And he uses this term epistemological behaviorism to describe his view. It might sound a little intimidating, but it basically means that knowledge is rooted in our behavior, how we interact with the world and each other.
Okay, I think I'm starting to wrap my head around this.
Uh-huh.
So what does it mean for knowledge to be rooted in our behavior? Can you give us an example of how this epistemological behaviorism actually plays out in real life?
Sure, think about learning a new skill, like playing a musical instrument. We don't learn that just by reading a book or thinking about music theory. We learn by practicing, by getting feedback from others, by being part of a community of musicians.
That makes a lot of sense. It's through our actions and interactions that we really come to understand music and how to play it.
Exactly. And Rorty would argue that this kind of knowledge isn't just about mastering a technique, it's about becoming part of a community, sharing a common vocabulary and a set of practices.
So knowledge is as much about how we engage with the world and other people as it is about what's going on in our own heads. It's a lot more dynamic than just mirroring reality.
You got it. And this is where Rorty's ideas start to get really interesting and challenging because he applies this view of knowledge to our understanding of truth itself.
Ah, yes, the truth.
Yeah.
Now that's where things get really spicy. We know that Rorty's view of truth is one of the things that made him so controversial. Can you give us a taste of what he argued and why it ruffled so many philosophical feathers?
Well, he claimed that truth isn't about accurately representing reality, but more about what he called unforced agreement within a community. In other words, something is true if it's a belief that we come to accept and agree on within our social and linguistic practices.
Hold on a sec. So he's saying there's no objective truth out there just waiting to be discovered. It all boils down to what we as a community decide to agree on.
That's a simplified way of putting it, but it captures the essence of his challenge to the traditional notions of truth. He argued that we should give up on this quest for a God's eye view, a single correct way to represent the world, and instead focus on how our vocabularies and beliefs evolve through conversation and social interaction.
Wow, that's a pretty radical departure from how most people think about truth. I can see why he was such a lightning rod in the world of philosophy. I bet some people accused him of being a relativist, saying that any belief is as good as any other.
You're right on the money. That's one of the most common criticisms he faced. But to really understand his position and how he defended it, we need to dig a little deeper.
Well, I'm ready to dig. Let's continue this conversation in our next segment, see how Rorty tackles that whole relativism challenge. I have a feeling things are about to get even more interesting.
So we left off with this pretty radical idea that maybe truth isn't what we always thought it was.
Yeah, I'm still trying to wrap my head around Rorty's critique. It's like he's saying truth isn't this fixed thing out there in the universe, but more about what works for us in our communities.
That's a good way to put it. He argued that we get all tangled up philosophically when we try to define truth as this perfect match between our thoughts and reality. He wanted us to shift our focus from defining truth to understanding how it actually functions in our lives.
So instead of trying to answer what is truth, we should be asking how do we use the idea of truth?
Exactly. For Rorty, truth is more like a tool we use in language to sort of recommend certain beliefs and sentences. It's a way of saying, hey, this belief is justified. It's reliable. It's something we should accept. It's not about finding some external guarantee. It's about warranting our beliefs.
Okay, so that connects back to his idea of epistemological behaviorism, right? It's not about finding some foundation for knowledge outside of us, but figuring out how to justify our beliefs within our communities through dialogue and stuff.
You got it. Justification is the key for Rorty, not some big T truth out there.
But wait a minute. Doesn't that lead us straight into relativism? If truth is just whatever we agree on, doesn't that mean any belief is as valid as any other?
That's the million-dollar question, and Rorty knew it. He really tried to make a distinction between his view and relativism.
Okay, I'm all ears. How did he deal with that?
Well, first of all, he wouldn't say all beliefs are equally good. He still believed in standards of justification, providing reasons, having productive conversations. It's just that those standards come from within our practices, not from some outside source.
So it's like the rules of the game emerge from the game itself, not from some rule book you pull out beforehand.
Great analogy. Rorty argued we shouldn't think of justification as separate from our language and community. It's something we create together through dialogue and debate.
Now I see how this ties into his idea of solidarity. Remember, he called himself a postmodernist bourgeois liberal, and he kept talking about expanding our sense of we. It seems like all these ideas are connected.
You're exactly right. For Rorty, the goal isn't to find the truth with a capital T. It's to broaden our moral community, to see the humanity in a wider range of people, to figure out how to live together more peacefully and justly.
So instead of searching for some universal principle that unites everyone, we should focus on building relationships, understanding different perspectives, and finding common ground.
Exactly. He believed that's how we make moral progress, not by discovering some objective moral law, but by getting better at seeing ourselves and other people.
Okay, but how do we actually do that? How do we build those bridges and expand our sense of we in a world that feels so divided and polarized?
Well, Rorty put a lot of faith in what he called cultural politics.
Ah, yes, cultural politics. Another one of those Rortyisms. I'm starting to get the hang of his lingo.
It basically means that the way we talk about things, the stories we tell, the words we use it all, has a huge impact on how we understand ourselves and each other and how we live together.
So it's about recognizing that language has the power to shape reality.
Exactly. Rorty thought that social change doesn't come primarily from abstract philosophical arguments or political theories. It comes from changes in our vocabulary, our metaphors, the stories we tell about ourselves.
Can you give me an example of that in action?
Sure, think about how much our understanding of gender and sexuality has changed over the past few decades. Those changes didn't happen because someone found some new philosophical truth about gender. It happened because activists, artists, everyday people started telling different stories using different language, challenging the old narratives.
That's a powerful example.
Yeah.
It shows how language can either reinforce existing power structures
Right.
or help us imagine new possibilities.
Precisely. And Rorty believed we should be more aware of how our language shapes reality. And we should use that power responsibly to try to make the world more just and humane.
This is also thought-provoking.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to admit, I'm still not quite clear on how we move from these abstract ideas to actually doing something. How do we put this into practice? How do we become more empathetic, expand our sense of we, and make a difference?
That's the big question, isn't it? Rorty didn't give us a step-by-step guide, but he pointed us in some promising directions. He emphasized things like education, literature, art, open and honest conversation. These are the things that can help us break down barriers, build compassion, and create a more inclusive world.
So it's less about finding the perfect blueprint and more about creating spaces where people can connect, share their stories, and challenge each other's perspectives.
Exactly. He believed progress happens gradually, through small acts of kindness, understanding, and solidarity, building bridges one conversation, one story, one relationship at a time.
This is really starting to click for me. I feel like I'm starting to see the world through Rorty's eyes. But there's one thing I'm still struggling with. If we let go of these traditional ideas of truth and objectivity, what's left to guide our ethical and political choices?
Now that's the question Rorty leaves us with, and it's one we all need to wrestle with. He didn't give us a ready-made answer, but he urged us to keep the conversation going, to question our assumptions, and to keep striving for a better world.
I think that's a good place to stop for now. We've covered so much, and I need some time to digest it all. So join us for part 3 as we dig even deeper into the implications of Rorty's philosophy and explore how we can actually put his vision into action. All right, so we're back, and we left off with this really big question. What guides our moral and political choices if we let go of those traditional ideas of truth and objectivity?
It's a question that really goes to the core of what Rorty was trying to do. He's asking us to rethink the very basis of our ethical and political beliefs.
Yeah, and that can be a little unsettling. It's like he's pulling the rug out from under us, but not giving us anything to stand on instead.
Rorty was hesitant to offer any kind of grand narratives or simple solutions. He thought we create meaning and purpose through our own conversations and what we do not by looking to some higher power.
So instead of searching for a rule book, we should focus on how we make ethical decisions.
Exactly. He said we should cultivate ironism, which is basically being self-aware about how our own beliefs are influenced by our own circumstances and history.
Ironism. Okay, another one of those Rorty terms. It sounds kind of like skepticism, but I'm guessing it's a bit more complex than that.
You're right. It's not about doubting everything, but about realizing that our beliefs are always shaped by the time and place we live in. They're not eternal truth. They come from our history, our culture, the conversations we have.
So an ironist is someone who recognizes that their own perspective is limited and that they could be wrong.
That's a good way to put it. Rorty believed that being an ironist was super important for moral and political progress, because it helps us be humble about our own beliefs and open to learning from others who see things differently.
That makes sense. It's the opposite of being dogmatic. We don't cling to our beliefs like they're absolute truths. We acknowledge that they might be flawed and that they can change.
Exactly. He argued this kind of ironic attitude makes us more tolerant, more humble, and more willing to have open conversations. And that's the basis for a more democratic and inclusive society.
So in a way, Rorty's saying that letting go of the search for absolute truth can actually make us more ethical and more engaged in politics.
It's definitely a thought-provoking idea, and it's caused a lot of debate. But I think there's something powerful about it. It pushes us to move beyond simplistic ideas of right and wrong and to engage with the world in a more nuanced and compassionate way.
It's all starting to come together for me. His critique of traditional epistemology, his emphasis on language and conversation, his vision of a more inclusive society, it all comes from this commitment to ironic inquiry and this willingness to embrace uncertainty.
Exactly. Rorty offers a new way of thinking about philosophy, not as a search for timeless truths, but as an ongoing conversation, a shared project of making sense of the world and trying to build a better future.
That's a pretty inspiring vision.
Yeah.
But it also brings up some practical questions. How do we actually do this? How do we cultivate ironism and encourage open-mindedness in a world that often seems so resistant to those things?
Well, Rorty thought education was crucial. He said we should teach students not just to memorize facts, but to think for themselves, question their assumptions, and debate respectfully.
So it's about empowering people to really participate in the conversations that shape our society.
Exactly. And it's not just about formal education. It's about fostering intellectual curiosity and open-mindedness in our communities through things like book clubs, public forums, even just our everyday conversations.
That reminds me of something we talked about earlier, the power of storytelling. Rorty saw literature, art, even journalism as vital for shaping our moral imaginations and expanding our sense of who we are.
Absolutely. He thought these forms of cultural expression could help us see the world from new perspectives, build empathy, and challenge our preconceptions.
So it's not just about having the right ideas, it's about finding ways to connect with people emotionally, to make them think differently and see the world in a new way.
Right. He believed that reason and emotion work together to shape our beliefs and actions. He saw how powerful stories are for changing hearts and minds and making the world more just and compassionate.
Wow, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive into Richard Rorty. It's been challenging and thought-provoking, but ultimately really inspiring. He's given us a lot to think about.
He certainly has. He was a bold and original thinker who made us question some of our most basic assumptions about knowledge, truth, and what it means to be human.
And even though he didn't offer any easy answers, he gave us a framework for thinking about these big questions in a more thoughtful and humane way. He reminded us that philosophy isn't about finding absolute certainty. It's about joining the ongoing conversation of humanity.
That's a great way to put it. I think Rorty would be happy to hear that. He wanted to make philosophy relevant to the problems we face today and to inspire us to work together to build a better future.
Well said. So if you're looking for a philosopher who will shake things up, challenge your thinking, and leave you with more questions than answers, Richard Rorty is definitely someone to check out. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.